Imagine living in a place where it rains 300 days a year, where rainfall can exceed 150 inches annually, where everything you own would rot, mold would consume your food, and staying dry seems impossible. Most people would call this environment uninhabitable. But the Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest didn't just survive in this endless rain. They thrived for thousands of years, building massive structures that could house 60 people under one roof, stay completely waterproof through months of relentless storms, and last for generations. Welcome to FROSTIVIAN, where we explore how ancient peoples conquered Earth's most extreme environments. Today, we're diving into one of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history: the cedar plank houses and longhouses of the Pacific Northwest. Structures so advanced that modern engineers study them to understand waterproofing techniques we've only recently rediscovered. By the end of this video, you'll see why these weren't primitive shelters. They were engineering masterpieces that solved problems our modern buildings still struggle with. So let's discover how Native Americans turned the wettest place on Earth into home. The Pacific Northwest coast stretches from Northern California through Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and into southeast Alaska. This region is one of the wettest places on the planet. We're talking about truly staggering amounts of rainfall. Some areas receive over 12 feet of rain every single year. That's not a typo. 12 feet. To put that in perspective, London gets about 2 feet annually. Even Seattle, known for rain, only gets 3 feet. The coastal rainforests of the Pacific Northwest make Seattle look like a desert. And it's not just the amount of rain. It's the relentlessness. From October through May, rain falls almost constantly. Not always heavy downpours, but persistent drizzle that never really stops. Days without rain are so rare that people celebrate them. This creates an environment where everything is always wet. The air is saturated with moisture. Fog rolls in from the ocean. Trees drip constantly even when it's not actively raining. The ground stays muddy year-round. For the tribes who lived here, the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, Nuu-chah-nulth, Coast Salish, and dozens of others, this wasn't a temporary challenge. This was reality every single day of their lives. So how do you build shelter in a place where water is your greatest enemy? Where wood rots in months if not protected properly? Where moisture seeps into everything? Where keeping fire alive and food dry seems impossible? The answer lies in one of nature's most remarkable trees, the western red cedar. And in the ingenious ways Native Americans learned to work with it. But before we get to the construction techniques, we need to understand why this environment, despite the endless rain, was actually incredibly rich. Because the same rain that made survival challenging also made this region one of the most abundant places on Earth. The western red cedar wasn't just a building material. It was the foundation of an entire civilization. These massive trees can grow over 200 feet tall and live for more than 1,000 years. But size wasn't what made them special. Cedar has natural properties that seem almost designed for the Pacific Northwest climate. The wood contains natural oils called thujoplycins that make it incredibly resistant to rot, decay, and insect damage. In an environment where most wood would decompose in years, cedar could last for decades or even centuries. The wood is also remarkably lightweight for its strength, straight-grained making it easy to split into planks, and it has natural waterproofing properties that repel moisture. Native Americans recognized these qualities and built their entire architectural tradition around this one tree. But they didn't just cut down cedars randomly. They had sophisticated forestry practices developed over thousands of years. They would identify trees with straight grain, minimal knots, and the right size. They understood which trees would split cleanly and which would be too difficult to work. And here's something that surprises people: they often didn't kill the tree. Native Americans developed techniques to remove planks from living cedar trees, taking only what they needed while allowing the tree to continue growing. This sustainable harvesting meant forests could provide building materials indefinitely. Now here's where the engineering genius really shows. Native Americans didn't have metal saws, no power tools, no industrial equipment. Yet they could turn massive cedar trees into perfectly straight planks 8 to 12 feet long and several inches thick. The process started with selecting the right tree. They'd look for cedars with straight grain, usually older trees that had grown slowly and evenly. Once identified, they'd make careful cuts using stone tools and controlled fire. First, they'd score the tree in a straight line from top to bottom. Then, using wooden or bone wedges, they'd carefully split the wood along the grain. Cedar's straight grain meant that with proper technique, you could split planks that were remarkably uniform. For living trees, they'd take planks from one side, leaving the tree's core intact so it could survive and heal. The tree would form new growth over the harvested area, and in decades or centuries, could potentially be harvested again. The planks they produced were typically 6 inches to 2 feet wide and could be 8 feet long or more. The surface was smoothed using stone adzes and scrapers, creating boards that were surprisingly flat and even. Building a plank house or longhouse was a community effort that demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge. The construction started with massive corner posts and support beams. These weren't small posts. We're talking about cedar logs 2 to 3 feet in diameter, standing 15 to 20 feet tall. These were sunk deep into the ground or set on stone foundations to prevent rot. Horizontal beams connected the corner posts at the top, creating a rectangular frame. Additional support posts ran down the center of the structure to hold the roof beams. The larger the house, the more support posts were needed. Some longhouses stretched over 100 feet in length and could be 40 feet wide. Then came the walls. Here's where the ingenious waterproofing system came into play. The planks weren't nailed or permanently attached. Instead, they were positioned vertically and held in place by horizontal rails on the inside and outside of the posts. But they didn't just stand them straight up. The planks overlapped like shingles on a modern roof. Each plank would overlap the one next to it by several inches. This overlap meant rain would hit the outer surface and run down, never finding a direct path inside. And here's the brilliant part: the planks weren't fixed rigidly in place. They could shift slightly, expanding and contracting with moisture without cracking or creating gaps. The overlap system meant that even as wood moved with seasonal changes, the building stayed watertight. The roof used a similar overlapping technique. Cedar shakes, which are like thick wooden shingles, were layered from bottom to top. Each layer overlapped the one below it. Rain would hit the top layer and cascade down the outside, never penetrating to the interior. Some tribes added additional waterproofing by using cedar bark. They'd strip long sheets of bark from trees, dry and flatten them, then layer them over the plank walls and roof. This created a double layer of protection against rain. Inside, these structures were incredibly sophisticated. The central fire pit wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a carefully engineered system with smoke holes in the roof, positioned to create natural draft. The smoke holes themselves were brilliant. They weren't simple openings that would let rain in. They were covered with movable planks that could be adjusted based on wind direction and weather. When positioned correctly, the smoke escaped but rain was deflected away. Around the perimeter of the longhouse, raised platforms created living spaces for different families. Each family had their own section with sleeping areas, storage, and workspace. The raised platforms kept belongings off the potentially damp floor and closer to the warmth that naturally rose from the central fire. Storage was built into the structure. Dried fish, roots, berries, and other foods were hung from the roof beams where smoke from the fire helped preserve them. Cedar boxes and baskets kept dry goods protected from moisture. The largest longhouses could house 60 people comfortably, with distinct family sections, storage areas, and communal spaces. These weren't cramped, uncomfortable shelters. They were well-organized homes designed for long-term living. The biggest challenge in any structure in the Pacific Northwest is managing moisture. It's not enough to keep rain out. You also have to prevent condensation, mold growth, and the dampness that comes from constantly wet air. Native Americans solved this through multiple strategies working together. First, ventilation was critical. The smoke holes in the roof created natural airflow. Warm air from the fire rose and escaped, pulling fresh air in from gaps near the floor. This constant circulation prevented moisture from accumulating. The planks themselves were breathable. Unlike modern materials that trap moisture, cedar planks allowed water vapor to slowly pass through while blocking liquid water. This meant the walls could regulate humidity naturally. The overlap construction also helped. Air could move between planks while water couldn't penetrate. This created natural ventilation within the wall system itself, allowing any moisture that did penetrate to evaporate away. The central fire did more than provide heat. It was a dehumidifier. The constant warmth kept the interior drier than the outside air, creating a gradient that pulled moisture out of materials rather than allowing it to soak in. A well-built cedar plank house could last 50 to 70 years before major reconstruction was needed. The oldest existing plank houses that were traditionally built are over 150 years old, and some are still standing. This longevity required regular maintenance. Every few years, planks might need adjusting or replacing. The roof shakes would be inspected and damaged ones replaced. But because the construction was modular, with removable planks, repairs were straightforward. When a plank did need replacing, the community would work together to split a new one from cedar. The old plank would be removed and the new one fitted into place. No need to tear down walls or reconstruct entire sections. The cedar's natural preservative oils meant that even without modern treatments, the wood resisted rot remarkably well. In the dry summer months, the wood would dry out, killing any mold or fungus that might have started growing. This seasonal cycle actually helped preserve the structures. Living in these houses meant understanding the rhythms of the rain. Winter was the wet season, when families spent more time indoors. The houses became the center of social life, with storytelling, tool-making, basket weaving, and other activities happening inside. The fire burned constantly, providing warmth, light, and the means to cook and preserve food. The smoke-filled upper sections of the longhouse helped cure fish and meat that hung from the rafters. Summer brought drier weather, though in the Pacific Northwest, dry is relative. During these months, many activities moved outside. The houses were aired out, repairs made, and storage replenished for the next winter. This seasonal pattern meant the houses served different purposes throughout the year, adapting to the changing needs of the community. The cedar plank houses of the Pacific Northwest represent something remarkable, a building tradition perfectly adapted to one of Earth's most challenging climates. These structures weren't temporary shelters or crude huts. They were sophisticated homes that provided comfort, security, and community for thousands of years. When European explorers first arrived in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1700s, they were astonished by what they found. They expected primitive conditions. Instead, they discovered massive wooden structures, some over 100 feet long, housing dozens of people in organized comfort. These buildings demonstrated engineering principles that Europeans were only beginning to understand. The overlapping plank system for waterproofing, the ventilation design for moisture control, the use of natural materials with inherent preservative properties, the modular construction allowing for repairs and modifications. Today, architects and engineers study these traditional designs. Modern green building movements have rediscovered principles Native Americans knew for millennia. Using local materials, building with the climate instead of against it, creating structures that breathe and regulate moisture naturally, designing for longevity and repairability rather than replacement. The Pacific Northwest plank house tradition also teaches us about sustainable resource use. Native Americans managed cedar forests for thousands of years without depleting them. They took what they needed, used it efficiently, and allowed forests to regenerate. The same groves that provided materials 500 years ago are still producing cedar today. This stands in stark contrast to modern forestry practices that often clear-cut entire areas, destroying ecosystems and depleting resources in decades rather than managing them for millennia. Perhaps most importantly, these structures represent the deep knowledge that comes from living in intimate relationship with a place for thousands of years. Every detail of construction, from the angle of the roof to the spacing of planks, was refined through generations of observation and experience. Native Americans didn't have to figure this out from scratch. They inherited knowledge passed down through countless generations, each adding their own insights and improvements. This accumulated wisdom created building techniques that worked in harmony with the environment. So the next time you see rain falling endlessly and think about how challenging that would be to live in, remember, Native Americans of the Pacific Northwest didn't just endure the rain. They mastered it. They built homes so effective at handling moisture that modern buildings still struggle to match their performance.